Welcome to the RNL, the Revolution Nothing Less show. Today is Thursday, February 13th. This is our 235th episode. My name is Sansara Taylor, and we have an absolutely incredible show for you today. Before I get to that, I want to call your attention to the important protest that refusefascism.org has called for this upcoming Monday, February 17th, President's Day, to declare, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. These protests are an urgent step towards bringing forward the sustained mass protest and resistance among millions of people across this country that becomes so powerful that it creates the kind of profound political crisis such that Trump cannot govern this country and implement his fascist program. This is urgent. Trump and his MAGA fascists are moving at breakneck speed to purge the federal government and remake it at every level into a cutthroat instrument of fascist atrocity. They are moving to intimidate and silence anyone who would oppose them and to carry out a program of dehumanization and deportation of immigrants, complete genocide of the Palestinian people, brutal enslavement of women, erasure of trans people, open and terroristic white supremacy, accelerated destruction of the environment, and potentially world war, even nuclear-armed world war. Millions, tens of millions of people are shocked and shaken by this. Millions do not want this. But this only matters if these millions are called forward to act as a political force of opposition very quickly. So we urge you to go to refusefascism.org to get involved not only in attending the protests they have called, but in building for them, spreading the word about them, and strengthening them in any way you can, including bringing others into that. So with that, let me turn to the very special episode that we have for you today. We are absolutely thrilled that on today's episode of this, The Revolution Nothing Less show, we will be releasing the entire first of two interviews that I recently did with Bob Avakian. Bob Avakian is an extraordinary revolutionary leader and thinker who has not only talked the talk, but walked the walk unwaveringly for over 60 years. Through years of work and struggle and sacrifice, Bob Avakian has brought forward a whole new way that humanity could be living, a scientifically grounded vision of a world free of exploitation and oppression, a reality-based strategy to make the revolution necessary to get there, and a thoroughly scientific method and approach to bring growing numbers of people into navigating this and all the challenges along the way. And Bob Avakian is providing real-time strategic leadership to make this revolution real. There really has never been a leader like this in the history of this country, and there's never been anything like the new communism that Bob Avakian has brought forward in the history of the world. He is building on the best of previous revolutions while solving the biggest problems they ran into and the new challenges that have been thrown up in the world since then, so that humanity really can fight our way out of this madness and really get free. If ever there was a time that this matters, that time is now. So without further ado, here is the first full interview that I did with him here on the Revolution Nothing Less show. My name is Sansara Taylor. I want to welcome you to a very special set of interviews here on the Revolution Nothing Less show with the revolutionary leader Bob Avakian. We enter 2025 at a truly momentous time. Bob Avakian, I'm so happy to welcome you back to the Revolution Nothing Less show.
Well, thank you. It's very good to be here. And as you said, these are very heavy and very important times. So it's really a good thing that we're doing. It's been very important.
So there's a lot that we want to cover in this interview, but I want to dive right in with what we're most immediately facing right now, which is in just a matter of days, the Trump MAGA fascist regime is going to assume the power of the presidency. This time around, he's got the backing of all three branches of government. He is assembling a cabinet full of woman haters, Christian fascist crusaders, immigrant bashers, science deniers, climate destroyers, outright lunatics. And I wonder if you could just help us understand, what are we facing with this regime? How should we understand the stakes of this?
Well, I think, it's very interesting. We're facing fascism. And, I said it's very interesting because, as you recall, no doubt, toward the end of the election, the Democratic Party hacks finally came out and said, oh, this Trump, he's a fascist. Then as soon as he won the election, oh, well, he's not really a fascist. He's not really a threat to our capitalist imperialist. Okay, they didn't say capitalist imperialist, to our democracy. You know, after all, he's the president. So, and then you see this whole parade of all these tech, bros and, heads of corporations and Democratic Party officials and, commentators from MSNBC and whatever rushing to, to get on the good foot with Trump, So this is a very serious situation, as you said. There really, it really is fascism, nothing less, which means like the undisguised, open, aggressive dictatorship of this system of capitalism, imperialism, as you said, in the world's most powerful capitalist imperialist country. And a lot of people, including a lot of these, ruling class figures and major media figures and so on, don't want to acknowledge, or maybe can't even believe that it's fascism, even though they said it right before the election as kind of an election ploy, because of their American chauvinism. The idea of American exceptionalism, that this great country, how could it actually become fascist? Which, of course, ignores the whole history of this country, which began with slavery and genocide, and then even after slavery was ended, had generations of, the most unbelievably atrocious and terroristic, rule over masses of people, particularly black people, but others as well, for generations, right up until the recent times of as late as the 1960s. So if you actually look at this so-called exceptional country, you can easily see how it could become all-out fascist with an open, undisguised dictatorship. The rule of the capitalist class is always a dictatorship in reality, but this is an open, undisguised, aggressive, blatantly, as you said, racist, misogynist, and all the rest.
So why did you, pretty much starting immediately after the election, in your social media at Bob Avakian Official, and then repeatedly, including in the major New Year's statement you just delivered recently, insist that now is not the time for demoralization and despair. It is a time for righteous anger and revolutionary determination?
Well, because unlike these ruling class figures, we have no interest in this, in getting along with this fascism. The people who, and there are tens of millions, the people who have hated it for years, ever since Trump emerged as a major figure on the scene almost 10 years ago, the people who recognized how terrible it is and have hated it for all this time have no interest in now finding a way to go along with it. The fact that it's been brought to power through the very workings of this system, which is something to think about. It didn't come to power through a coup. It came, it wasn't a military takeover. It came to power through the normal processes of this system. And the fact that that could happen should tell us something very basic about the whole system itself, along with everything else that people need to know about the actual nature and what of this system and what it actually does. But we, the people who hate all this racism, misogyny, immigrant persecution, and all the rest of it, who don't want to go back to a dark ages time when we can't even accept basic scientific understandings like evolution, and instead we're supposed to believe some thousands of years old biblical mythology, in place of science. That's something also we should talk about. This is a rejection not of the 1960s and all the righteous struggle that went up against the racism and the misogyny and the rest, and the persecution of gay people, etc. But it's also going back even before the Civil War. That's why you see a lot of these MAGA fascists carrying Confederate flags. And even beyond that, it's going back to the Enlightenment of several centuries ago, which even though it was, part of the rise of capitalism, nevertheless had the very important element of saying that things should be approached on the basis of actually looking at reality and applying reason to try to understand reality. And these Christian fundamentalist fascists, and that's what they are, who are the driving force behind this fascism and behind Trump, behind the whole MAGA thing, they want to go back and reject all of that and substitute mindless lunacy in place of it. So the reason why it's time to be angry and full of revolutionary determination is, that we refuse to go back to that. We refuse to allow this system to drag us back into a dark ages kind of existence, along with all the terrible forms of oppression that it's going to be aggressively reinforcing.
So the Radcoms have raised, and you have put out as well in your social media, two very important slogans. One is, "In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America." And the second is, "This whole system is rotten and illegitimate. We need and we demand a whole new way to live, a fundamentally different system." I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance of these two slogans, each of them in their own right, and maybe also how they relate to each other.
The refusal to accept fascism is extremely important. That goes along with what we were just talking about, the question you just asked. Why is this a time for righteous anger and revolutionary determination? But the first part of that first slogan is also very important. It's the foundation that people need to have to really take this on. That is, in the name of humanity. That's the orientation that people need, not, what's good for America, the most predatory destructive imperialist power in the history of the world. Not what's good for America, but what are the interests of humanity. And we proceed from that. And on that basis, for the people of the whole world, it is a very disastrous development to have this fascism coming to power in this most powerful capitalist imperialist country, which is already wreaking havoc on masses of people around the world as well as in this country anyway. But this is going to take it to a much more aggressive, even more extreme level and expression. So in the name of humanity, that's how we approach this. So that's the first slogan. And out of that, because we understand what the effects of this and the consequences of this is for humanity, that is why we refuse to accept it. Unlike all these bourgeois capitalist politicians who are rushing to make, good with Trump and go kiss the ring and all the rest of it, we have no interest in that. Our interests lie with the masses of humanity. It goes along with what I said before. The important thing is the whole world. The whole world comes first, not American imperialism and American chauvinism with the ridiculous and outrageous idea that this country, with its terrible history and present reality, is somehow better and more important than every other place in the world, and that the people here are somehow special and more important than all the masses of humanity in the billions around the world. So that's the basis for the first slogan. Now, as for the second slogan, it goes to what I was saying just a little while ago. This fascism arose out of and it's been fed by the soil of this whole system and this whole history, the whole history of this country. If you just look at the history, look, a lot of people said, back in, the 80s and so on, they rose up against South Africa and apartheid. What was being done to people in this country, particularly though not only in the South, from the time shortly after the Civil War all the way up through the 1960s, was every bit as horrific, if not more so, than what was happening, the terrible oppression of the masses of African people in South Africa under apartheid. So, how can you look at that and not recognize, once again, that this is the soil out of which this fascism has grown? It is why, once again, you see the Confederate flags being, taken through the Capitol on January 6th at the time shortly after the last election. It is why these people, some of these people openly say that slavery was better, supposedly even better for black people than the time since. This is what you're dealing with in this country, and it is this system and the way it has developed in this particular country that has given rise to this fascism. And that should tell everybody that there's something fundamentally sick about this whole system. Plus the fact that it's a completely outmoded way for people to live and for society to be organized. So that, a small number of billionaires, for example, control more wealth than more than half the world's population. You know, and that's just not some kind of like, oh, you know, we should redistribute the wealth kind of thing. It flows out of the nature of a system that's based on exploiting masses of people all over the world. You know, the women in Bangladesh, literally the children in Africa, the people in Haiti and other places in the Caribbean and Latin America who are, you know, working under, you know, horrific conditions, producing the wealth that goes into the coffers, if you will, of these billionaires and the heads of the capitalist system in this country. I mean, just think about a simple fact. You hear about all this stuff about immigrants and Trump talking about renaming the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America. Think about a simple fact like this, which tells you a lot of what you need to know. The wages of people producing things that are consumed in this country in Mexico are approximately 1/10 of what people working in this country working on the same things make. And that is why, for example, even people who are not well off in this country can have a certain amount of consumer goods because of the super exploitation of people in these countries all over the world, which enables these consumer goods in this country to be relatively low priced. And this is blood money that we don't want and that no decent person should want. And it's absolutely absurd that this is the way the world is organized and enforced on the masses of people. You know, think about it. There is the technology and the knowledge that has existed for some time now and is constantly being developed so that everyone in the world could have all their basic needs met, and there would still be a lot to enable people to engage in cultural efforts and all kinds of other, you know, things beyond just mere survival. There is absolutely no reason why anyone is suffering from want in this world today with the technology and knowledge that exists. There's only one reason. There's no good reason, but there is a reason. And that reason is that all this is controlled by a small number of capitalist exploiters who don't just exploit within this country or any other particular country, but super exploit people all over the world, especially in places like Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. So, you know, this fascism flows out of all of this. It's an extreme, but in a certain sense, a logical expression or extension of all that I've been talking about. And it's completely unnecessary. We could have a whole different way to live. And this is what's being kept from people. And understanding, you know, that there's no reason why we have to keep living this way with such deprivation and destruction, to say nothing about the threat of nuclear war that's becoming greater these days between the U.S. on the one hand and its rivals in Russia and China, all of whom, by the way, are nuclear-armed imperialist powers, and with the whole destruction of the environment, all of which is posing existential threats to humanity as a whole. There's absolutely no reason why we're still living this way. So just to, you know, go back to that, that's why we say this system is completely rotten and illegitimate. Any system that, you know, brings about the things that I'm talking about and perpetuates itself on the backs of masses of people, any such system is completely illegitimate. And yes, there is a positive alternative to all this, much as they don't want people to know it.
So I'd like to pick up on the second part of that slogan. We need and we demand a whole new way to live, a fundamentally different system. Let's say we had a time machine and we could just fast forward into the future, into a revolutionary society, one that's based in the Constitution that you wrote for the new Socialist Republic in North America. How would things be different? What would it look like? What would it feel like? I know it's a really big question, but maybe you could just give a sense of what it would be like.
Yes, that is a big question, but it's an important question. Some things would be very different and would feel very different right away. For example, under the present system in this country, more than 1,000 people are killed by police every year, disproportionate numbers of black people and other people of color. There's mass incarceration of people who've been deprived by this system of a decent way to live and have been essentially, many of them, millions and millions of them, locked out of the formal economy. So immediately, that would be done with. Immediately, yes, there will be a need for security forces. There will be a need for forces to defend the revolution, while at the same time defending the rights of the people in a way that is not done under this system. But there will no more be this rampant and wanton murder of murder by police of masses of people over and over and over again, killing more than 3 people a day in this country, and doing it in the most wanton, and brutal ways, infused in many cases just with the most grotesque racism. That will be over right away in day one. And it will not be the situation where people are without a means to a decent life, even though there will be a transition period where breaking free from the whole world capitalist imperialist economy will be a real struggle. One of the goals is we are no longer going to build an economy based on exploiting the children in Africa and women in the tens and even hundreds of millions, not only in Bangladesh but around the world, and masses of people. At the present time, for example, under this system, the great majority of the things that are produced, that are consumed in this country, are produced outside of this country. And by the way, for all the Trumpites and all the rest of the, lunatic people out there, that is not going to change. Trump is not going to bring back all these old, factory jobs and everything, because this system could not survive for any period of time, maybe not even a week, if it weren't exploiting and super exploiting these people around the world. And we are going to move away from that. And as we're doing so, everyone will be able to and will be involved in developing the economy and having a decent way to live, even while we're carrying out the struggle to completely break free of this imperialist parasitism feeding off the masses of people in the world. So that will be radically different too. Also, certain things like, I mentioned evolution. Evolution is written into the Constitution for the new Socialist Republic that I've written. It's a scientifically established fact, one of the most firmly established facts in all of science, and in the new society, it's going to be treated as such. And if people don't understand that, then there'll be education and struggle as necessary to enable them to understand it. And other things, for example, the right to abortion as well as the right to birth control, that is also written into this Constitution. There will be no depriving of women of their fundamental rights. The same with the rights of LGBT people. That is written also into this Constitution. That is foundational to what we're talking about. So on every level, in terms of abolishing the oppression and exploitation that is the foundation of this system, which people just assume is the normal way that things have to be, all that will be, overturned and transformed and done away with, starting on day one. And then there's a whole realm of education and culture, which, the purpose of which will not be to brainwash people and condition them to serve an exploiting system, but the purpose of it will be to enable people actually to pursue the truth on a scientific basis, giving expression to curiosity, which is suppressed in 100 ways under this system. It's one of the most striking things, especially these days, the way in which curiosity is suffocated in people. The lack of curiosity is a striking phenomenon in this society now, a whole different culture which gives expression to uplifting relations among people, emancipating relations. And then there's a whole international dimension where the whole orientation of the new socialist government will not be to carry out military action to slaughter people or to back something like the genocide now being carried out by Israel against the Palestinian people in order to reinforce, by bloody means, the basis for all this exploitation and super exploitation of people around the world. Instead, the whole international orientation of this new society and new government will be to support people rising up against this and fighting for the same emancipating goals. So we could go on, but in every level, things will be radically different. And, people say, people might, like to go back to John Lennon's Imagine. You might say this is just a dream, to paraphrase that, but it's not. It's grounded in the reality of what is possible now, as I spoke to. Thousands of years of human history and development have led to a situation where there's a foundation for everything I'm talking about to actually be achieved. There is a material foundation in the world for this. As I said, in the technology and the knowledge that exists, the only thing that's standing in the way, and doing so in a monstrously bloody way, is this system of capitalism, imperialism. And as that's swept away through a revolution of millions of people, then we can go to work to actually bring about the reality of what I'm talking about, some of which, once again, will begin right on day one. No, there will not be any more mothers and fathers, loved ones and others, having to cry these tears of anguish and outrage over their loved ones being cut down by the people who enforce the system. Instead, this system will be backing the masses of people. And as I've said before, with the new security forces that are envisioned and will be brought into being with this revolution and envision this constitution, the orientation that people will be led with is that they would rather give up their lives themselves than wantonly kill masses of people, as happens every day under this system.
I think today people have such an impoverishment of even being able to imagine that anything could be different than what we see today. And what you're describing is really emancipating. It's very liberating. And I think it's important that we explore this more fully. But I want to first pick up on something that you've been emphasizing. First, in the negative, speaking about the Trump MAGA fascist regime and their all-out assault on science, on rationality, on reason, even going back to the Enlightenment, in the negative. And then in the positive, when you're speaking about the revolution that you're fighting for in the future, you're putting a tremendous emphasis on science, on evolution, on the importance of that. And so I wonder if you could speak to both, why is science so important? Why are the attacks on science so dangerous today? And why is a promotion of science such an important part of the revolution and the change that we need to bring about for emancipation?
The attack on science is dangerous because science is the way to actually understand the world as it is. That's not to say scientists don't make mistakes. Of course they do. But the whole orientation and method of science is to actually engage reality, to draw, facts and evidence from reality, and then to analyze that reality and synthesize it, to draw, together the patterns, to analyze and, bring to light the underlying and driving forces in reality. So it's a method for actually understanding reality as it really is, as opposed to all kinds of inventions of distortions of reality that have, held sway for thousands of years in human history. And it's time we get beyond all that. So rejecting science is opening the door to misleading people and to spreading all kinds of, not just misunderstanding, but outright lunacy. It's outright lunacy to refuse to accept the scientific fact of evolution. You cannot understand the world. You cannot understand the natural, the natural world. You cannot understand the development of different, beings through the, in different forms of life throughout history, or even the emergence of human beings without the scientific method of evolution. And to reject that means that you are opening the gates to all kinds of lunacy and irrational approaches to reality. So, science is the means to go at and actually understand reality as it actually is. And that's a continual struggle. Scientists, just like everybody else, sometimes get things wrong, but they keep applying the scientific method to learn and then to correct the errors that they make, or to advance the knowledge and build on what they come to understand. And, it's not just scientists that can and need to apply the scientific method. Everybody, in a basic sense, can and needs to do that. We want to understand the world the way it really is. What is the actual reason that people are, to go back to Richard Pryor, why are you in the situation you're in today, Well, in that particular routine of his, You know, it's a junkie talking, and, he's saying, you know, he's talking to another guy, and he's saying, you don't know how to get along with the white man. That's your problem. I know how to get along with him. That's why I'm in the situation I'm in today. Well, see, there's an example of an unscientific approach, which Richard Pryor is ridiculing with his humor, while doing it lovingly. If you really want to understand why you're in the situation you're in today, you need science. And if you want to do something about the situation you're in, if you don't think the situation you're in is one that people like yourself and others should be in, then you need a scientific approach in order to understand how to do that. Is there actually a way to do that? That's a real question. The answer is yes, but you need science to get to that answer. You know, all kinds of crazy ideas come forward, or ideas that lead people into the wrong ways of approaching things. For example, this whole idea, which has gained a lot of currency now, that the problem is just these CEOs of corporations. You know, and we should go, people say that the answer is to go after them. But that's not going to change anything, because they can just replace CEOs, first of all. Second of all, it's an act that doesn't really, you know, lead to anything positive, and in fact just makes it easier for the system to come down on people. So it's completely misplaced and wrong-headed to begin with, but it flows out of a superficial understanding, or really basic misunderstanding of what the problem is. It's a whole system that the CEOs of corporations are just the outward expression of, and they can be easily replaced, and the system will keep on replacing them, because it's living off the masses of people in the world, and it has the basis to replace these people much more, you know, just one after the other. So without science, you can get led off into all kinds of wrong and actually very harmful ways of approaching, even trying to change, you know, the system, or change society, or change the way people are living. So that's the importance of science, to actually understand the world the way it is. And this applies, you know, through, you know, every sphere and every dimension of society and the world, the natural world as well. You know, the scientific method is a way to understand reality. I keep coming back to this because it's so important. To understand reality as it actually is, and as it's moving and changing, so that you can change it in accordance with the way that it needs to be changed, but also in the way that it can be changed in a positive direction.
Yeah, you know, you bring up the targeting of the CEOs and seeing them as the essence of the problem.
Actually, I think I got to correct. I think Richard Pryor, as Junkie said, I know how to deal with the white man.
Okay.
That's why I'm in the situation I'm in today. Excuse me, go ahead.
No, it's a very important correction. I wanted to pursue this, though, about the targeting of CEOs, and it relates to something that I wanted to ask about, which is that there has been really a growing phenomenon of people, especially young people, identifying as anti-capitalist and seeing capitalism as a problem. And I wondered if you could speak to both what accounts, you think, for this rise in anti-capitalist sentiment, but also how popular understandings of capitalism differ from a scientific understanding of what capitalism actually is and how it actually functions, and why this distinction matters.
The problem is when people think that they're opposed to capitalism, or when they talk about capitalism, they just think of it as greed, or just, you know, the wrong distribution of the very lopsided distribution of wealth, where, like the billionaire class, has too much wealth, and there's too many people going without, which is true again, but that's just once again an outward expression of the deeper reality of how this system actually functions. And capitalism is a system based on exploitation. It's based upon a small number of people accumulating wealth from the labor of other people. That's the essence of capitalism. It's also the essence of every system of exploitation. If you think about it, if you go back to slavery, well, it's obvious that people are accumulating wealth from the labor of others. Or, even the feudal system where you had serfs and big landowners exploiting the serfs. They were getting wealthy from the exploitation of the serfs. Under capitalism, it's more disguised, because the outward appearance is, well, you go get a job and they pay you a wage, and it's an equal exchange. They pay you a wage, and then you work for them, and then they make money off of that, but you're getting a wage in return. So it seems like it's some kind of equal exchange. But really, through the process of capitalist exploitation, people, and not just in this country again, but all over the world, including these children in Africa and elsewhere, are creating a lot more wealth in the time that they're being forced to work for these capitalists than is equal to what they get paid. So the rest of that wealth is accumulated by the capitalists. And a very important point along with this is that it's not just one group of capitalists all sharing the wealth collectively or cooperatively. That's not the way capitalism works. Capitalism is a system of separate ownership of the means of production, the factories, the land, the raw materials, the machinery, the technology. These big capitalist corporations accumulate billions of dollars through ownership of these means of production, the means of producing wealth by exploiting people using those means of production. But they're all in competition with each other because each of them is accumulating privately. So, you see it constantly. Even the gigantic corporations and other forms of capitalist wealth get driven under through the competition. And so, with other capitalists. And this is, again, is a worldwide phenomenon at this stage in the development of capitalism and this stage of human history. And so, this leads to like a lot of anarchy under the capitalist system. And that's why, things don't get produced that people need but are not profitable to capitalists or not profitable enough in terms of their competition with other capitalists that are either in the same field of exploitation or somewhere else, but ready to pounce on them and take over from them if they don't keep up in the ruthless competition. This is what capitalism is. It's a system that's driven by this exploitation and by this anarchic competition among capitalists, which then gets expressed even on the level of countries, where capitalist states are in conflict with each other over the, areas where they can exploit people more profitably, over key sources of raw materials that they need to accumulate, more cheaply, over strategic parts of the world and trade routes. And that's why you have all these wars and conflicts and everything else. This is what capitalism is, and as I have been referring to, we're now at the stage where it's capitalism imperialism, which means it's a worldwide system of exploitation, not just exploitation within a particular country by the capitalists within that country. They're all competing, especially the big ones, on an international scale, and this leads to all the chaos and madness, and yes, war on a huge scale repeatedly because of this basic anarchic drive to outcompete each other by, more intensely exploiting people and by introducing new technology that enables them to more effectively accumulate capital. That's the capitalist system. And it leads to the fact, this is something that, it's actually, it's almost unbelievable, but it's true. Something I've pointed out before, think about World War II, which developed out of this conflict among these capitalist imperialist powers and then involved, revolutionary forces in what was at that time a socialist state, the Soviet Union. But it arose out of this conflict among different capitalist imperialist countries. And think about, tens of millions of people died in that war, and there was tremendous destruction. Not in the U.S. because the U.S. itself, although there were hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers that died, but the U.S. was basically spared the destruction that many other parts of the world suffered as a result of that war because it was isolated from the main theaters of that war. But still, tens of millions of people died. In the Soviet Union, somewhere between around 25 million people died in that war. And that was, in fact, the major that war that was waged by the Soviet Union was the main way in which Nazi Germany was defeated, not by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the U.S. Army, although it played a secondary role. So there's World War II. But think about this. After World War II, with the U.S. emerging as the most powerful imperialist country in the world, replacing the British Empire as the most powerful imperialist. Since World War II, in that situation with the U.S., the most powerful imperialist predator in the world, and I use that word deliberately because it describes what they actually do around the world. Think about this. more than 500 million children, particularly in what's called the third world, or the south of the world, in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, more than 500 million children have died since World War II as a result of malnutrition and starvation and preventable disease because of the way the world is dominated by the capitalist imperialist system, with the U.S. sitting atop it all as the major predator. Just think how could anyone be, not just be totally, driven to want to bring about a major, fundamental change, knowing something like that, leaving aside all the other atrocities and horrors that are caused by this system. 500 million children. Think of it, and this is capitalism. This is capitalism, imperialism that is fundamentally responsible for this because of the way it dominates the world at this point.
In describing this and making the distinction between seeing capitalism mainly in terms of greed and just the accumulation of wealth versus the way you were describing with both the viscerality of what we're facing, but also the much more scientific understanding of what capitalism is. Why is that distinction so important? What difference does it make to understand it that way?
Because if you just think it's greed, then, you could think that, well, we just have to curb the greed of some of these super rich, these billionaires and whatever. We just have to curb the greed and redistribute the wealth. And you don't understand that you can't redistribute the wealth in any fundamental term because the whole system will collapse. If you think about everything I was describing about the way this capitalist imperialist system actually works, its actual internal dynamics that drive it. If you think about that, if you try to curb the accumulation of tremendous wealth by these capitalists, and they're going to go under to other capitalists, and the whole system will come apart at the seams and will and lead to complete chaos. And that's why I say Trump is not going to bring back all these factory jobs that all these workers have been, have lost, including a lot of black people and others have lost, which isn't talked about enough, as a result of the development of capitalism, imperialism, once again since World War II, and particularly in the last 5 decades or so, since the 1970s, when it's become much more globalized, internationalized. So, you have to get to, once again, it's like you have to get to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is the basic nature and the basic driving dynamics of the system. And you have to completely replace that system. You have to completely overthrow and uproot it, and then develop an economy that doesn't depend on 2 things. Doesn't depend on exploiting masses of people, and isn't driven and riven through by this ruthless anarchic competition among competing capitalists. So, you have to have a whole different foundation. You have to have an economy that collectivizes the means of production that I talked about, that on that basis can carry out a unified, planned approach to developing the economy in the interests of the masses of people, while providing not just for their immediate material needs, as important as that is on a constantly expanding basis, but also, an increasing enriched cultural and intellectual life for the masses of people. But that's because instead of this, this whole system being riven and driven by this conflict, this anarchic competition among capitalists, you, in essence, pool the wealth that the people are creating, and then you use it in a planned way to meet their needs, while at the same time having the basis to defend that revolution, that new society, from those who would try to overthrow it and drag people back to the horrors of the old way. So if you don't get to the root and you don't fundamentally change most basically the economy, and then along with that all the social relations that go along with this exploitative system, and all the culture that reinforces it in the most putrid ways, you know, and all the misinformation that's pumped into people's heads to get them believing that this is the only way things can be, and you just got to go for yourself within this horrific system. You have to change all that, beginning with the economic foundation that's actually oriented to, and not only has the intention, but has the material foundation and basis to develop the economy in a planned way to actually meet the needs of the masses of people. And to get to, and this is something that I think is really important to understand, to get to the point where the question of individual survival is no longer a question for the masses of people, but because that is guaranteed. You know, when people, for example, talk about human nature, well, that's just human nature. People are selfish, da-da-da-da-da. The reason people say that is it's a reflection of the capitalist system they live under, where people are forced to compete with each other in order to, you know, to even advance individually, and in many cases, even in order to survive. But with a planned economy based on a collective ownership of the basic means of creating all the wealth of society, you can move beyond that, where that's guaranteed. And then, you know, at the same time on that foundation, you can bring about the transformation of people's thinking to where they no longer are, quote unquote, selfish in the way they are conditioned to be under this system. So, you know, that human nature changes with the nature of the system. All this is like, you know, possible now. And not only is it possible, it cries out to be urgently done before this system, you know, literally, you know, puts an end to, you know, at least to human civilization as we know it, which is a very real question. But even if it didn't do that, it creates and enforces a whole dimension of horror for humanity that is not only horrific, but is totally unnecessary.
So I want to come back to the more immediate horror that we're facing with the Trump MAGA fascist regime assuming power and all that this is going to mean. I think part of what hit decent people extra hard with this election is this time around, Trump didn't just win the Electoral College. He also won the popular vote as well. And so you hear it all the time. We're being hammered with this notion that the American people chose Trump. You know, politicians, the media, they're always constantly bombarding us with this. And some people say this to make the case that Trump is legitimate. We should just accept him. And some people say this out of despair, like there's nothing we can do. The American people supported Trump. What do you say?
Well, I say bullshit. There are a lot of different levels to this. You know, first of all, in terms of the total popular vote, you know, Trump got only a little bit more than he got in 2020. Maybe 1 or 2, maybe I guess about 2 million more votes. And, you know, Harris, his Democratic Party opponent, got far fewer votes than Biden, the Democratic candidate, did in 2020. So, you know, that's one thing to understand. That was the major shift. Seems like a lot of people who had previously voted for the Democrat didn't vote for one reason or another. And it'd be important to actually learn more about what the different reasons for that would be. But that's sort of on one level, you know, that, and, you know, the fact is actually Trump got slightly less than a majority of the popular vote. And, you know, when he defeated Harris by a couple of million votes. So right there you see that, you know, the idea that the American people, as I've said before, voted for this is ridiculous. The country was split down the middle, and everybody knows it, you know, even if they don't want to say so, because they, you know, the ones who don't want to say so don't, you know, want to try to pretend that this is the only legitimate process is these elections. And in fact, let's step back a bit. These elections only present the masses of people with a choice between one or another group of representatives of the ruling class of this system of capitalism and imperialism, which we've been talking about. So those are your choices to begin with, you know, and we could get into why are those the only choices. You know, it's not just that, you know, these political parties have a lot of money, you know, billionaires and whatever backing them, which both parties do, by the way. But it's also that this, you know, that the system can only function if it has political, you know, rulers or political leaders who are operating in accordance with the interests of this system as they perceive them and strive to carry them out. Anybody who tries to run for office, who wants to present a program that would go against the fundamental interests of the system, will first of all be locked out and be minimized and marginalized. But even if they could somehow, come to office, they would be confronted with the fact that there's no other way to operate under this system than the way it already operates. And we've seen this phenomenon. This is why politicians say they're going to do this and that, they're not going to do this and that, and they turn around and do just what they said they wouldn't do, or don't do what they said they would do, because the system enforces them to do that. It can only operate on certain basic principles and dynamics which were rooted in its fundamental nature, which I was speaking to. So, this is what these elections are about in a more basic sense anyway. And so what you have is a contest between what's the best way for this system to perpetuate itself, and, particularly the ruling system in this country, the ruling class of this country, what's the best way for it to perpetuate itself over the masses of people and to fight for, and including in a literal military conflict, to enforce its interests in the international arena. That's what that's what's being debated out here. And, however people think that, this election, whatever they think it's about, that's what it's essentially about. And that's what they're voting for. And a lot of these Trumpite MAGA fascists know that's what they were voting for. They know they're voting for, bringing back the Confederate, what's represented by the Confederate flag and all the misogyny and everything else. But, beyond that, in more fundamental terms, the elections under this system are just a conflict or a contest between different sections of the ruling class over how to rule and pursue the interests of the system that they represent. That's all these elections under this system can ever be about. Now, in these times, you have a very, sharp, even antagonistic conflict within the ruling class itself over how to pursue those interests, both within the country and in the international arena. And as much as the Democrats, as soon as the election was over, tried to smooth things out and get everybody to go along and say this is all legitimate after all, there's still this conflict between, should we really roll back all the concessions that have been made in the struggle against the oppression of women and LGBT people and against white supremacy? Should we really roll all that back? Should we really, as Trump's saying, should we really go and change the name of the mountain in Alaska back to Mount McKinley, in order to assert the foundational white supremacy and whiteness of America, and so on and so forth? Versus Democratic Party politicians who think that more inclusion and diversity is the way to hold this system together. Those are conflicts which are real issues, but they're always, in the elections and overall, on the part of these ruling class representatives and parties, they're always fought out on the terms of the system itself. Never is there an election in which a major party and candidates actually put forward a program that would completely uproot all this oppression, discrimination, inequality, and all this, rampaging in the international arena, and all this vicious super exploitation of children and others. I talk about children, I keep talking about this. The reality is that there are besides the hundreds of millions of children who died since World War II, right now, there are more than 150 million children being ruthlessly exploited and super exploited in countries, particularly in the third world, all over the world. This is what this system rests on, and never in these elections is there anything that would, touch on these fundamental relations and driving dynamics of this system. So you have, not just in this country, but in a number of countries, you have a section of the ruling class and a section of the population that they mobilize that actually feels that moving to fascism is the best and really the only way to maintain the superiority of the system and of the conquering interests, if you will, of the country, that they are part of. So you have a section of ruling classes, not just here, but in other countries too, that says that outright fascism, whether they're willing to call it that or not, outright fascism is the way that this system needs to operate and the way it needs to be defended and extended. So this is what we're dealing with, but it's all fundamentally on the terms of this system, which functions as I've described it, with all the horrors that I can barely describe in the time we have.
When you're talking about the fight among the rulers over how to best maintain this system, its stability in this country and its domination around the world, why should it matter to understand that there are conflicts between them? And what do you say to people who hear this and say, well, you're just describing they're all the same. They're all no good. I knew that already.
They're all no good, but they're not all the same. See, that's an important distinction to understand. They all represent the same system, which is not only just no good, but is a real horror. And that's not some kind of exaggeration or hyperbole. It's a real horror for humanity. They all represent that, but they have real, basic differences which have become extremely sharp and even antagonistic over how to rule this country and how to maintain, for example, the American empire of exploitation and plunder. So it's important to understand these differences, including because if you're going to wage a struggle against this system, and especially a real revolutionary struggle to uproot and abolish the whole system, you need to understand what you're up against. You need to understand all the contradictions and conflicts that are at play and how they affect the political situation, the understanding or the sentiments of masses of people in order to be able to transform that in the way that you need to. And if you ignore that and you just do this simplistic thing, well, they're all the same, you're ignoring a big part of reality. And for example, I know, I've even heard, some black people say, well, Trump's a racist. But at least he's open about it, so it's easier to deal with that. I mean, I'm sorry, but how ridiculous can you be? That's like saying, well, it's better to be shot in the brain than it is to be slowly poisoned. But it is important, if one person is going to shoot you in the brain and another plans to feed you poison, it's important to know that, in order to maneuver your way through it and deal with all of them. So, maybe that's a crude analogy, but the point is you have to understand the actual, once again, science. You have to understand the actual reality you're dealing with. And the conflicts within the ruling class are very real. They're all on the terms and on the basis of the same system, but they're very real and very acute right now. And that has implications in terms of how you go about, moving to uproot and abolish the whole system. And if you ignore that with a simplistic notion that, oh, they're all the same, then you're not going to get anywhere in terms of dealing with, look, one of the things people will say to us when they actually get what we're talking about, a real revolution to actually overthrow this whole system, they'll come back to us with how difficult that is. And they're not wrong. This is an extremely difficult and complex process, and you have no chance of carrying it out and no chance of uprooting all this horror that people are subjected to if you don't have a scientific understanding of all the major phenomena and conflicts and contradictions that you're dealing with that are shaping things. So that's, is the basic answer to that question. It's just, you're just not going to get anywhere, once again, science, if you don't understand reality, not just in basic terms, which is a beginning, but in all of its complexity and the movement and development of different contradictions and how that's influencing people. The conflicts within the ruling class don't exist in a vacuum. They're influencing people of different parts of society because different sections of the ruling class are trying to appeal to different sections of the people. And this is having an effect on them. This conflict within the ruling class has its reflections and reverberations, if you will, throughout the society. If you don't understand that, you're not going to get anywhere basic, and you're not going to get anywhere close to where you need to go.
You've been emphasizing in your social media messages, and actually you were just speaking to this, that there really are two countries within this country. It's not one United States of America, but a very sharply divided country. And that the decent country needs to defeat this fascist country. And in your social media, you describe the need to bring forward tens of millions of people and massive opposition and resistance on such a level in this country that we create the kind of profound political crisis where Trump literally cannot govern the country and implement his fascist program. What would that look like? I think people have a very hard time imagining something like that.
Again, it goes back to, your basic understanding and your basic orientation. Is your orientation, well, I guess the people have decided this, so we have to go along with it? Or is it, this is an outrage, and, no matter by what means it came to power, it is totally unacceptable and we will not go along with it? That's sort of a basic bedrock stance. Then, once again, you need science. You need to understand, how can, something like this actually be affected in the way that you were just referring to. Think back to, for example, not that long ago. I know people are conditioned in this country to have short attention spans. It's one of the big problems we have, But think back just a few years, less than 5 years now, to 2020, for example. The whole thing that erupted on a massive scale when the cold-blooded, ruthless murder of George Floyd, along with other murders like Breonna Taylor and so on, was just too much. This happens all the time, but this was just too much. And people poured into the streets. And I remember people, ordinary, regular people saying things, and very sincerely, go ahead. I remember seeing, for example, on the RNL show, we had a clip of one woman in one of these massive demonstrations, which in 2020 involved millions and millions of people. I remember this one woman very sincerely saying, go ahead and kill me if that's what it comes to, because black people are dying out here every day being, slaughtered by the police. So, that kind of outpouring, people, forget things too quickly, including they forget what they actually accomplished, because ultimately that struggle was led into a dead end with demands that had no reality to them, like defund the police, which is never going to happen under this system. But, at its high point, it had such a profound effect that even, I can think, for example, of the, thoroughly reactionary owner of the Dallas Cowboys having to come out and take a knee and pretend to care about these murders of black people over and over again. And other major figures, corporate heads and political figures, all the way up to the very top, had to pretend for the moment to care about this. And these fascists, although they, barked and, raved and ranted, were isolated and put on the defensive politically for this period of time. And this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I say we need a movement of people that is, so powerful and so determined that it actually creates such a major political crisis and impact on the whole society that it shakes up everything even at the top, and Trump is actually unable to govern. And how that actually works out in the ranks of the ruling class and all over is not something that, can be predicted or that I'm attempting to predict right now. But you can see the potential for that to happen. If you look at things like 2020 and the mass outpouring. So people have to have the orientation and the determination and the courage in the face of all this, and in the face of all these ruling class figures capitulating and running to kiss the ring of Trump, people have to say, it's up to us, it's our responsibility. To hell with all these politicians and others who are running to, kiss ass to Trump. It's our responsibility, and it's our mission to take to the streets in massive numbers and keep coming back. See, that's one of the things that is very important. I lived through the 60s and actively took part in the 60s. One of the things that was very important about that, whether it was the struggle of black people or against the Vietnam War or around women, so on and so forth, was that, people didn't just come out in a wave of struggle and then when that receded, that was it. They came back again and again and again. For example, in protesting in massive ways against the Vietnam War, You'd have big protests, and the government, our government, quote unquote, the US government, would escalate the war in Vietnam. You'd have another massive protest, and they'd escalate the war in Vietnam. But people didn't say, oh, I guess they're not listening to us, so I guess we'll just go home or crawl back into, into a hole. People got more angry. People came forward more powerfully. They brought forward more numbers. And that's what needs to happen now. And this is what I mean by creating, through massive and determined struggle of millions and millions of people, the kind of political situation, the kind of profound political crisis where it really becomes a situation where Trump cannot govern the country and cannot implement his fascist program.
You described in the 60s not saying, oh, they're not listening and then just giving up. But I think today, in a very widespread way, people have become convinced that the whole point of protest is to get them to listen, or maybe to be channeled then into the quote unquote realistic mode of electoral change. And I just wonder if you want to speak a little bit more to how what you're describing is very different than that.
It's important to understand, most people, when they start protesting under the existing system, they're not thinking that they're going to go all the way to trying to get rid of the system. They are largely coming from the place of, we got to make our voices heard. We got to let the people in power know that we don't want this, and we've got to make them listen, and when we make them listen, then they'll change things. That was definitely true in the 60s. I remember the early demonstrations, what are you talking about, civil rights, or you're talking about anti-war, or whatever you're talking about. That was the mentality, and those were the sentiments of most of the people who took part at the beginning. The question is, what do you do when it becomes more and more clear that the people in power, yes, they heard you, but they don't give a damn, because they have interests that are fundamentally opposed to yours and fundamentally opposed to what you think is decent and moral, if you want to put it in that way. I mean, look at Biden. What is Biden's legacy along with Harris going to be? Genocide and mass incarceration. That's the real legacy of Biden and the whole Biden-Harris administration. And why did Biden continue, and why is he continuing right now in the very last days of his time in office? Why is he continuing to pump, military aid to Israel, as well as continuing to increase the U.S. aid to the proxy war against Russia in Ukraine? Because fundamental interests of the system are involved. The role of Israel as an outpost and as an attack dog for U.S. imperialism in this crucial strategic region of the Middle East is of fundamental consequence and importance for the whole U.S. capitalist imperialist system. And that's why, 99 physicians who were in Gaza wrote an open letter to Biden and Harris telling them in very, very clear terms the genocide that was being carried out and the massive scale, beyond even what the figures are, of the death and devastation this is causing. And they didn't care. It didn't impact them at all. Why? Because fundamental interests are involved in this system. So they're going to continue even in the face of all this. And, it may have even contributed to Harris losing the election that they pursued this, but there were more fundamental things at stake. Their service to this system was more important to them. They are more dedicated to this monstrosity of a system than they care even about their own political fortunes in the short term, much as they do care about that. Excuse me. So, when you see this, what do? Well, I guess the problem's just too big for us, so I guess we'll just go home, or we'll slink back and, into the woodwork and talk about doing things locally or do self-care or whatever. I understand why people get discouraged, but the thing to do is not to get discouraged, it's to get more angry. And as a foundation for that anger, get a deeper understanding of what you're up against and what you're dealing with. To take the example again of the Vietnam War, it wasn't primarily the massive and growing demonstrations against the war in this country that forced the U.S. government to pull back from Vietnam. There was a whole complex of factors, including the whole international situation, and including how the protests in this country affected the military of this country, where, as they've admitted, in stages of the Vietnam War, especially the Army, was becoming unreliable. There were rebellions in the Army. So all that was very important. And even if it wasn't the most basic reason why they pulled back from Vietnam, it was a very important contributing factor, because the very stability of rule of this system was beginning to be shaken in very fundamental ways as a result of their continuing the war in Vietnam and massive numbers of people coming to oppose it. And so the same kind of thing needs to happen now around this fascism represented, this MAGA fascism of Trump and this whole regime that's coming to power. And more fundamentally, and this has to do with the two slogans we talked about, more fundamentally, people need to look and see, why is it that this system doesn't listen to us? When clearly what we're saying is right, clearly what we're saying is moral, clearly what we're saying is righteous, but they don't listen. Why don't they listen to us? And what should we conclude from that? Should we conclude, well, I guess they're not going to listen, so we just have to go, back into the woodwork and go for ourselves? Or should we conclude there's something fundamentally wrong with this whole system? Some fundamental thing about its very nature which requires it to carry out, it's incredible atrocities like the genocide in Gaza that's fully armed and backed by the U.S. I mean, one of the signers of that letter, the 99 physicians and others that I referred to, made a simple statement. He said, how can it be the fact that there is no major political party in this country for whom genocide is a no-go? Think about that statement. What does that tell you? There's no major with all their very acute, even antagonistic differences, neither party considers genocide a no-go. Genocide is a go if it serves their fundamental interests, and they will back it to the hilt if that's the case. What should you do in the face of a recognition of that? Shrink back, or come forward even more powerfully and even more fundamentally dig into the nature of the beast that you're up against and what's really necessary to deal with this beast in the way it needs to be dealt with?
You have made the point that theory is the dynamic factor in ideology, and that most fundamentally people act on the basis of what they've come to understand. And you were just speaking to this. And I think right now, today, people often, you hear this at the high tide of any mass struggle, whether it be 2020 or the righteous uprisings on the campuses recently against the genocide in Gaza. At the high tide, you hear people passionately insisting that we're just never going to give up, and believing that the main thing that will determine their success is their refusal to give up, their determination to keep fighting. And yet over and over again, time goes by, these movements face heavy repression, they come up against other limitations, and at least for now, these movements have subsided. And so I wonder if you could speak more about this role of theory and really understanding the nature of the system, and the importance of theory in persevering and actually advancing in these struggles and in actual liberation.
Yeah, well, I think it's like, what, to use Marxist terms, there's a dialectical relation, a back and forth between sort of a basic moral stand and the theoretical understanding that you're talking about. I mean, it's been said, and it's very important. First, you have to care. If you don't have the mentality and the morality to care about what's happening to people, the kind of things I've been talking about, the very real horrors that are very real, that I've been describing and referring to. If you don't even care about that, then of course you're not going to do anything. But a lot of people do care. So that's a starting point. You have to care. But then the question of how do you understand, excuse me, what you're up against is going to have a determining influence on what you do on the basis of initially caring. If you don't understand what you're up against, if you think, well, we just need to let them know how we feel. We just have to let them know that this is really wrong, and then that doesn't work, quote unquote. They don't respond. They don't care that you care. Well, then you just, if your understanding doesn't go any deeper than that, then you are going to kind of pull back. But if you can see, here's the thing. Nobody, well, let me put it this way. Almost nobody starts out as a revolutionary or a communist or whatever. There are a few people who, what they used to be called red diaper babies, who grew up with communist parents or whatever, and a lot of them didn't turn out so well because it isn't a matter of genetics and it isn't a matter of just your upbringing. You actually have to develop an understanding. And my point here is that most people who do develop into revolutionaries and communists do so through the back and forth of experience and then learning more deeply about what that experience teaches them in the context of the larger things going on in the world. That's certainly, how I developed to where I am, and I'm sure that it's true for you and, most people, again, who come to this understanding. And that's where the theory enters in. And the theory is not just abstract. Once again, it goes back to a scientific method. You have to, when you run up against obstacles, you have to examine and analyze and synthesize scientifically what is it you're up against, how does that relate to deeper things, how does it interconnect with other things, and what is the essence of this? What is the core of this, and what does it show you, and then what does it require you to do? And that's where, again, the dialectic, if you will, the back and forth between science and morality comes in. Because you can come to an understanding, oh man, it's the whole system. But I don't want to sacrifice to try to deal with the whole system, especially when nobody else seems to want to do it. Well, that's a question of like your morality. And it's either going to be a positive dialectic, a positive back and forth influence, or it's going to be a negative one. If it's a positive one, the more that you come to understand scientifically, the more you're going to be fortified in your determination to do something about it. If it's a negative, process, the more that you come to get a sense of what you're up against, then if your morality is just, going for self, or I'll sacrifice up to a point, but not when it really matters, well, then you're going to pull back. So that's how those things are interconnected and continually mutually influencing each other. And in that relationship, in an overall sense, while the morality is extremely important, again, first you have to care, the scientific approach and the increasing understanding, or the theory, if you want to put it that way, is the main thing that you can, that you can take initiative around in order to, actually move forward rather than backward in the face of the obstacles that you face. You understand more deeply, and then that can lead you, if you started out caring and you continue to care, then when you learn more, your theory, the scientific approach, enables you to understand more what you're up against. Then, if you continue with that morality of caring, you're going to be more determined to go deeper and farther, or further, whichever is the correct in this particular thing, might be further, to go deeper and further in actually fighting through to get to the root of the problem and to uproot it. So, the theory, in an overall sense, the increased scientific understanding is the thing that gives you the most initiative, but it does go back and forth with your basic morality.
You have come back to the question of sacrifice and courage a number of times today. And I wonder if there's anything you want to share from your own personal development about how you have rooted yourself to find the courage and to make the sacrifices you have made, and how other people should find that courage, especially in these very, very heavy times.
First, you have to care. I could go into a whole thing, which I won't do here, about my upbringing, including some religious elements of it where, my parents, especially my mother, were very religious, but it was a kind of religion that, said you should care about other people and you should care about what's happening to people. Not just those immediately around you, but more broadly, even though it was within a certain limited framework. And, as I came up, I encountered all these things that were wrong, that were terrible, that were unjust. The treatment of black people. And then as I learned more about other people who were oppressed and discriminated against, it became, intolerable to me, and then at a certain point, I encountered people who had a deeper understanding of this. And I was willing, to learn from them. I was anxious to learn from them. I wanted to know, okay, look, these things are terrible. They're intolerable. People shouldn't be, to put it in basic terms, people shouldn't be treated this way. Here and all, all over the world as I learned more. So how do you understand why this is happening? And there were people that I interacted with that had an understanding of this up to a certain point. And I listened to them, I argued with them when I didn't understand what they were saying or I didn't agree with it. There's nothing particular about me. Everybody has their own specific, development, in terms of where they come from and the experiences they have and all that kind of thing. But, you face junctures along the way where, you come to understand more deeply what you're up against. And again, here's where, the increased scientific or the deeper scientific understanding enables you to understand more. But then you face, again, the question of what are you going to do about that? And, are you going to just pull back and, think only about yourself? Or does the thing that drove you to care in the first place drive you to understand more deeply and to get more deeply involved? And, that's what has happened with me. And as I learned from other people along the way, I also applied myself where I thought there were shortcomings and what even people I greatly respected, what their understanding was and what they said needed to be done or what the problem and the solution was, to put it that way. I applied myself deeply. I learned from them where they taught me a great deal and where I could understand that what they were saying was actually in accordance with what was actually happening. But I also, felt the need, and put it that way, to go further. Yeah, further. I felt the need to go further in order to get a deeper understanding of these things. And that's as I've said many times, that's a continuing process. It's a lifelong process of continuing to deepen your scientific understanding of what is the actual cause of all these horrors that you come to see and cannot, somehow accommodate to, or, go ahead just living your life knowing that all these horrors are happening. You have to keep going deeper to understand what is the cause of all this? What is it all rooted in, and how can you deal with it? How can you put an end to it? Is there a way to put an end to it? That's a real question. It could be that there are just a lot of horrors and there's nothing that can be done about it. But as I pursued a scientific approach and gotten deeper and deeper into that, I've come to understand that there is a solution to this. It's not an easy one. It's one that requires struggle and sacrifice and, yes, courage. But it's a real one, and it's a pressing, urgent need for the masses of humanity that we all apply ourselves to bringing this about. Because what's going on and accepting the way things are going is both unnecessary and therefore all the more intolerable. So, that's my own personal development. And, for whatever combination of reasons, I have felt, for decades now, since I first really started learning about this and getting a beginning understanding of it, that, whatever abilities I had, whatever, strengths I'd been able to accumulate as a result of my own personal situation and development need to be applied to bringing about, and contributing as much as I can, along with others, to bringing about the actual solution to all this. So that's what's continued to motivate me.
Well, it has been incredible first part of this interview where you ended it. I hope people really take that into their hearts. I want to thank you for sitting down, and we'll take a break and we'll be back for some more.
Great.
So there's very little that I want to say after all of that. Really, I just want you to let it sink in. That was 60 years of accumulated experience and wisdom, tremendous heart, revolutionary impatience and passion, moral example, and a journey of scientific exploration of some of the most burning questions of our time. I want to let you know that you can find out more about Bob Avakian, including his official biography and his body of work at revcom.us. And I want to make sure that you share what you just watched with friends, with family, with people that you're meeting who are agonized about what's happening. Donate as well. Donate to help get this out to others, especially in this time when so many people are questioning what's going on, trying to make sense of it, wondering if there's a way out, and wondering if there's anybody to lead in this time. Getting these interviews with Bob Avakian out, getting his leadership known can make all the difference. So please give generously. And finally, I want to urge you to stay tuned to this channel. If you're not yet, please subscribe to this channel and click the notification button so that you know immediately when we drop part 2 of this interview. In that next interview, Bob Avakian goes extensively into the new communism he has forged and brings alive the new revolutionary society this will bring into being. And Bob Avakian returns to questions of great immediate importance, like the question of leadership, including his leadership, and of really confronting and defeating Trump MAGA fascism and the whole rotten and illegitimate system of capitalism imperialism that gave rise to it and so many other atrocities. So as always, I want to say thank you to the Revolution Nothing Less team for putting this episode together. I want to urge you to leave a comment below, and we'll see you back here next Thursday. Good night.